Hi, this talk is going to be about the relationship between Deleuze and Haraway, or more particularly, kind of an intervention into and a response to Haraway's, I think, very poor reading of Deleuze. But it also wants to then think more about how should we understand the idea of becoming animal. So it's not just a question of saying Haraway is wrong, which I will say. It is also a question of trying to think in a more affirmative sense about, well, what does becoming animal actually mean? Um, I'm going to start in a fairly provocative way, and then sort of move on from there. So let's start with a question. Did Deleuze hate pets? And if he did, was he wrong to do so? Now, these are not generally the sort of questions that concern Deleuze scholars, but they are illuminating because to answer them, one must reckon with the difference between what Deleuze says about actual animals, which needs to be further broken down into the difference between his opinions about animals and his theoretical speculations, and we shouldn't confuse the two, and what he and Guattari meant by becoming animal. Now, Haraway really only cares about what Deleuze says about actual animals, and as a consequence, she completely fails to understand what he and Guattari meant by becoming animal, which in fact has very little to do with actual animals. As far as Haraway is concerned, this just means Deleuze and Guattari do not take earthly animals seriously enough. One can imagine Deleuze and Guattari replying that she does not take unearthly creatures seriously enough, and they would not be wrong. Her interest in the natural world does not extend to the supernatural world. She quite pointedly refuses the connection to Lovecraft implicit in her concept of the Thylacine, and instead connects it to a spider that was, nevertheless, as she notes, named in honor of Lovecraft's creation. By contrast, Deleuze and Guattari are clearly fascinated by the ontological implications of Lovecraft's work, which they cite several times in the development of the concept of becoming. It would be an understatement then to say Haraway and Deleuze and Guattari are at cross purposes. But Haraway's argument with Deleuze and Guattari still matters for two reasons. First, because it highlights a common misapprehension of their work, namely a tendency to treat their concepts literally or just as problematically, scientifically, rather than philosophically. And second, because many people, including a great many Deleuze and Guattari scholars, seem to regard her criticisms as cogent. Now, in the published version of this paper, which will come out in Deleuze and Guattari studies in the not too distant future, I have a whole bunch of footnotes pointing to various pieces of work that have responded to Haraway in different ways and in my view, to a greater or lesser degree of success. I won't go through that now, but you will be able to find the footnotes later. So I imagine Haraway is not unaware of the pitfalls of not reading Deleuze and Guattari philosophically, but she flatly refuses to do so because, as she puts it, and I'm quoting, no reading strategies can mute the scorn for the homely and the ordinary in their work. Now, there is no evidence to support Haraway's claim that Deleuze and Guattari are scornful of the homely and the ordinary, but it is worth pausing for a moment on the surprisingly normative subtext of her complaint, because in many ways the most powerful feature of Deleuze and Guattari's work is their willing and sympathetic embrace of everything that is unhomely and extraordinary. So Haraway mistakes their embrace of the otherworldly worlds of schizophrenics for scorn of the homely and the ordinary, when in fact it is a profound attempt to try to find a language to better describe and therefore understand schizophrenia in its ordinary aspect as that which schizophrenics live with in their everyday lives. So her constant demand that everything needs to be connected to earthly reality of mud and bodies and so on is therefore, and doubtless unintentionally, a disparagement of the unearthly world schizophrenics sometimes are forced to inhabit. Haraway's response to Deleuze and Guattari's work is clearly premised on the view that we must all like pets, and that liking pets is an ordinary and, importantly, a virtuous thing to do. Ironically, for one so quick to criticize Deleuze and Guattari for their apparent antipathy towards pets, there is very little in the way of self-reflection in Haraway's work about the ethics, or indeed the practice, of owning pets, despite the fact that there are many aspects of pet ownership that are ethically questionable, to say the least. There are moments of self-reflection, of course, such as when she informs us that her book, When Species Meet, is the mutated spawn of her encounter with Foucault, and the book she thought she ought to write, which she was going to call The Birth of the Kennel, which would expose the fact that dogs live in the domains of techno power. But she never wrote that book, and these moments are few and far between. So, in not writing The Birth of the Kennel, she thought she was escaping species chauvinism. But in reality, all she did was substitute her own form of it for Foucault's. And this is evident in her angry reaction to Deleuze and Guattari's apparently negative statements about pets, which seems to blind her to what it is that they are actually saying with their concept of becoming animal. And nowhere does she ask what the concept of becoming animal might mean or what its value might be in its own terms. She simply declares that it has no value. Indeed, she goes much further than that. She says that she had hoped to find an ally in Deleuze and Guattari, but instead found an enemy. She expected to find support for her companion species project in their work because, as she puts it, their thinking worked so hard to get beyond the great divide between humans and other critters to find the rich multiplicities and topologies of a heterogeneously and non-teleologically connected world. Instead, she found nothing but scorn for all that is mundane and ordinary, and the profound absence of curiosity about or respect for uh, and with actual animals. And she even castigates Steve Baker for failing to observe what she calls the systematic nausea Deleuze and Guattari let loose against all that is ordinary. Now, although she readily acknowledges that Deleuze and Guattari never intended to write a biological treatise about actual animals, she cannot get past their apparent contempt for earthly animals. She expects them to like animals just as she does, without reserve or exception, and to concern themselves with the strictly material and manifestly mundane, without flights of fancy into the abstract and sublime, her words, realms of the immaterial, even though it is obvious to her as much as anyone else that their project is not about mud as much as she wants it to be, but rather the social, cultural, and indeed cognitive processes that make mud matter the way it does to Haraway. Now, it is probably just as well Haraway did not view the first segment of Deleuze's TV interview with Claire Parnay, which is entitled A is for Animal, because if she had, it would have confirmed all her sorriest suspicions about Deleuze's aversion to animals. Here he talks about actual animals, which is not something he does when he and Guattari develop the concept of becoming animal. Deleuze freely admits that he does not like cats. He says he cannot stand the way they rub against him. He concedes, though, that he admires the way they seem to know how to die. And let's remember he was himself dying at this point. He also admits that he cannot stand the way dogs bark. It is, he says, the stupidest of cries. They are the shame of the animal kingdom, he says. But having said that, he quite likes the way dogs howl at the moon. But what he really cannot stand is people who try to have a human relationship with their pets rather than an animal relationship, which by contrast he thinks is very beautiful. Even worse, in Deleuze's view, is the tendency in psychoanalysis to treat all animals appearing in dreams as stand-ins for humans, usually other family members. This, he says, is execrable. I cannot stand this. Ultimately, Deleuze is ambivalent about animals. He hates certain traits, but he's also fascinated by a whole range of other um, animals, including creatures many people find distasteful, such as ticks and lice. What fascinates him is the way all animals have their own worlds, and the influence of Usku is evident here, though we shouldn't necessarily treat it as decisive. These worlds contain territories, a notion that he and Guattari both worked on together, and they developed this idea into the concept of territorialization. But his fascination for animals should not be misconstrued for a critical interest in actual human-animal relations. And as I would want to argue, becoming animal is a hermeneutic category, not ethological category. Now, does this ambivalence about family pets make Deleuze a bad person? Haraway seems to think that it does. She is evidently quite incensed by Deleuze-Guattari's apparently hostile remarks about pets in A Thousand Plateaus. In response to Deleuze and Guattari's statements about pets, she declares rather petulantly, it has to be said, that she has a newly discovered loyalty to Freud, if only for the fact that he was a keeper of famously irascible chows. The remark that really sets her off, though, which she appears to take personally, is Deleuze and Guattari's observation that Ahab's Moby Dick is not like the little cat or dog owned by an elderly woman who honors and cherishes it. Haraway responds by saying, I am not sure I can find in philosophy a clearer display of misogyny, fear of aging, incuriosity about animals, and horror of the ordinariness of the flesh. To which she adds, now in full high dudgeon mode, that it took some nerve for Deleuze and Guattari to write about becoming woman just a few pages later. In the next breath, however, she says, from her vantage point of playing in the mud, I can even appreciate a great deal of A Thousand Plateaus. Haraway also expresses distaste for the familial human way of relating to animals, as in her words, cuddly, furry, childlike dependence. For this reason, she resists the common practice of being called a mum of her dogs. My multi-species family, she writes, is not about surrogacy and substitutes, all of which would seem to put her much closer to Deleuze and Guattari's position than she cares to admit. Although Haraway appears to be personally affronted by Deleuze and Guattari's remarks about elderly women, it is clear that she would not see herself as belonging to the Oedipalizing category of pet owner that they reject. So why is she so incensed by their remarks? Why are Deleuze and Guattari wrong in saying Ahab's Moby Dick is not like the little cat or dog owned by an elderly woman who honors and cherishes it? Or more to the point, why are they in the wrong for saying it? Why is this statement regarded as inherently disparaging towards women, the elderly, the ordinariness of the flesh, and those people who are curious about animals? On the face of it, it is simply a statement of fact that Ahab's whale, which he is willing to pursue to the end of the earth in order to kill it or die in the attempt, is quite clearly not the same kind of creature as the little cat or dog owned and cherished by an elderly woman or anyone else for that matter. What grounds do we have for assuming it is intended to say anything more than that? Haraway seems to think that Deleuze and Guattari are talking about actual elderly women and their dogs, but given that they are comparing them to a fictional character and a fictional whale, there is no reason to assume this. It is more likely that Deleuze and Guattari are referring to an equally fictional set of elderly women and their dogs, most likely of the variety one finds in late Victorian and early modernist literature, for example, Anton Chekhov, to which I assume the title refers to in any case, Henry James, D.H. Lawrence, Marcel Proust, we could go on. Now, this may not change much as far as Haraway is concerned because it could still be read as disparagement. But if it is a disparagement, the target is writers who Oedipalize animals, not elderly women and their pets. But even if it is the case that they are talking about actual elderly women and their dogs, in what way is it disparaging to say the dogs are cherished by their owners? Haraway is also opposed to Deleuze and Guattari's positioning of Moby Dick as exceptional. She says it amounts to a bad trip. It seems clear, though, that that was Melville's intent. In choosing Moby Dick, Ahab breaks with the law of the whalers, including Deleuze and Guattari here, according to which one should pursue the pack, and launches himself down a line of abolition that ultimately leads to his death. The whale is not Ahab's companion or pet, but something else entirely, a mad passion, a monomania, the anomalous. And the anomalous is neither an individual nor a species. It has only affects, Deleuze and Guattari say. It has neither familiar nor subjectified feelings, nor specific or significant characteristics. Human tenderness is as foreign to it as human classifications. Now, Haraway says she is bothered here by the lack of tenderness and the insubstantiality of the anomalous, which she says means that it belongs to a philosophy of the sublime rather than the earthly, features of the mud philosophy she sees herself as engaged in. But in so saying, she seems to miss the crucial modifier human. Given that the anomalous is defined as a phenomenon of bordering, which Haraway acknowledges, then how it could be anything but the insubstantial abstraction it is. Um, Moreover, does not bordering the process whereby one comes to the limit of one's sense of being and crosses over into another realm and becomes other, precisely describe the phenomenon Haraway so gleefully relates in the opening pages of the Companion Species Manifesto. Speaking of her encounters with her dog Cayenne, she writes, we have had a forbidden conversation. We have had oral intercourse. We are bound in telling story upon story with nothing but the facts. We make each other up in the flesh. Significantly, other to each other in specific differences, we signify in the flesh a nasty development infection called love. Her carefully crafted defamiliarization of the relationship between herself and her dog, and she even calls it a soft porn moment, which is very much tongue in cheek, makes it clear that the relationship between them is bordering in Deleuze and Guattari's sense, in that it takes both woman and dog beyond their traditional boundaries of subject and self. If we take her words seriously here, then is not the point of this playful moment precisely the repudiation of exclusively human forms of tenderness and human forms of classification? Is she not trying to desubjectify the interaction between herself and Cayenne? The language here, using phrases like oral intercourse, pushes the relation into the territory of the anomalous, which is to say, in Deleuze and Guattari's terms, she is more akin to Ahab than the elderly ladies she thinks they disparage. The relation between Ahab and his whale is different from the relation between elderly ladies and their dogs, not better or worse, anomalous rather than normative. The specific nature of this difference is the key to understanding both Deleuze and Guattari's concept of becoming and their perspective on human relations. Now, becoming animal does not conceptualize companionable human-animal relations like the one that exists between Haraway and Cayenne. Rather, it is about strange attractions and dark nuptials. It is a form of becoming other, not becoming with. Indeed, it is not even necessary that the animal actually exist. Imaginary, dreamt up, fantasized, and fantastic animals, including monsters, for example, werewolves, are just as important to Deleuze and Guattari as the fleshy living kind Haraway favors. Becoming animal is an unsettling process which may take pathological forms. It can manifest as neurosis, as it does in Little Hands, or psychosis, as it does in the case of the Wolfman. As such, it is strictly speaking incomparable to the kind of human-animal relations Haraway wants to talk about. As such, that she fails to see this is unfortunate because it means she sees an enemy in them when she could, in fact, have found an ally. But it is not the strangest part about her argument. The strangest part is that she seems incapable of entertaining the idea that not only is it acceptable to not like pets, but also that there might be very good reasons for not liking pets. And here it is important, I think, to point out a blind spot in Haraway's companion species project because it clearly determines how she reads Deleuze and Guattari. Putting it bluntly, her project is premised on a fantasy of mutual love between herself and her dog. It is a fantasy because she cannot know exactly what her dog actually thinks or feels. Regardless of how well we think we understand animals, the reality is that all we have are our own interpretations of their behaviors and expressions. We may feel that we understand them and that they understand us, sorry, but the reality is that we mostly speak to our pets in the imperative. Come here, sit, fetch, and so on. And our conversations are utterly one-sided. Even if the relationship between Haraway and her dog is a happy one, and have no reason to think that it isn't, it is still premised on a set of circumstances that, if they were applied to human relationships, even that between a parent and a child, for example, would constitute a form of structural violence. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting Haraway would ever be violent towards her dog and would in any way mistreat it. I'm sure her dogs have an absolutely fabulous life. But let us consider what it means to be a dog living under the care of a human. Humans decide for their dog where they will live, even if this means taking them away from their birth parents and litter mates. Who they will live with, other humans, other dogs, but also other animals, some they might want to eat, they're not allowed to, such as the pet rabbit or the family cat, and to a very great extent, how they will live. Humans decide their diet, when and how much they can eat. Some vegans even make their dogs vegans too, something I assume dogs would not choose to do if left to their own devices. Humans decide where and even when their dogs can go to the toilet, where they'll nap and sleep, and even where and when they can express their territorial instincts by barking and snarling at others. Humans decide when, indeed, if at all, and who they may have intimate relations with, including the decision to take away the possibility of procreation. Humans determine the amount, type, and frequency of physical exercise dogs are able to have. Thus, some dogs are more sedentary than they might want to be, while others are perhaps busier than they might want to be. I mean, do dogs really want to do agility courses? Humans make life and death decisions for their dogs to do with healthcare, medication, and end of life. Humans even sell their dogs. These issues are not altogether absent from Haraway's consideration of what the concept of companion species might entail, but neither are they given serious consideration. The possibility that any of this might constitute a form of structural violence is studiously ignored. Nowhere does she tackle the question of whether or not it is ethical to remove dogs from their families, say, or to desex them. Not only is she silent on all these issues, she also says that anyone who questions her concern for the suffering of individual animals must be some kind of fanatical acolyte of the one true faith, whatever that might be. In many ways, her talk about multi-species relating and existing is a smokescreen for the sometimes brutal practicalities of owning and having pets. If it is not ethically acceptable to forcibly desex one's human children, why is it ethically acceptable to desex one's dog? What ethical paradigm allows for this? And the only answer to this question is human exceptionalism, which Haraway claims to set aside. She acknowledges the fact that humans make decisions concerning healthcare and notes that there is a wide disparity in what people spend on dogs, both within the first world context and globally, but does not question the right of humans to make such decisions, nor consider the implications it might have for the agency of companion species. Haraway tries to short circuit this debate by arguing, plausibly enough, that dogs and humans evolved together, that humans didn't so much domesticate dogs as co evolve with them. But while this may be true at a species level, it does not alter the fact that on a day to day level, humans control the lives of dogs in almost every aspect. Moreover, evolving together does not grant humans the right of sovereignty over dogs. Given that dogs are not given the right to decide where they live, who they live with, and how they live, to what extent can one even begin to say that the relationship between humans and dogs is an ethical one? Just because a dog responds to the command come and wants to sleep on our bed or have their back rubbed does not mean they have consented to having every aspect of their lives determined and decided by us. In other words, it is a nonsense or at best an unconscious wish fulfillment for Haraway to say that human exceptionalism is refused when all humans hold all the cards that matter. In short, I'm saying it is okay to not like pets, which shouldn't be confused with being okay to be cruel to pets, which obviously I would reject. Now I want to turn to the actual reading of Deleuze and Guattari and to thinking a little bit more about how we might understand the concept of becoming animal. Contrary to Haraway, there is in fact a reading strategy which can mute the scorn for the homely and the ordinary in their work, and that is one which actually asks what problem does their concept of becoming animal try to solve. Most philosophical objections are philosophical in name only, according to Deleuze, to the extent that they are criticisms of the theory without any consideration of the nature of the problem to which the theory is responding, or the problem to which it provides the theory with its foundation and structure. This view of how to proceed in philosophical arguments is foundational for Deleuze, and it is expressed in his first book. So, what then is the animating problem at the foundation of becoming animal? That the answer is not obvious is a sign of a different prejudice at work, one which has been picked up like a virus from Deleuze and Guattari's own work, namely their supposed prejudice against interpretation. It is now more or less accepted as a doctrine that Deleuze and Guattari are opposed to all forms of interpretation, which in turn is taken to mean they could not possibly be interested in or have anything to do with something as old-fashioned and traditionally literary critical as hermeneutics. But the simple fact is they are interested in hermeneutics, as the development of the concept of becoming animal makes abundantly apparent. The problem becoming animal answers to is precisely the problem of how we interpret human animal relations as they are manifested in dreams and delirium. So, not ethology, but an interpretation of dreams. And this is a hermeneutic problem and not, as I said, an ethological problem because it relates to the interpretation of human, to interpretation, sorry, and not human animal relations. And their principal exhibit is the case study of Freud's Wolfman. It is not only used to demonstrate that psychoanalysis lacks the conceptual means of understanding the Wolfman, but also that by contrast, Deleuze and Guattari's own inventions are up to the challenge. And as I've observed elsewhere, and I won't discuss in a lot more detail here, I tend to take the view that their so-called anti-interpretive position is, as Jameson once put it, less a wholesale nullification of all interpretive activity rather than a demand for the construction of some new and more adequate model. And I think this is evident in their critique of Freud's analysis of Wolfman's case history. And basically, what they say is that his interpretation is wrong, not that he was wrong to interpret. What I want to suggest is that the way to think about becoming animal is to see it as the emergence of a new kind of hermeneutic problem. If we cannot approach dreams, fantasies, and hallucinations of schizophrenics in representational terms, then how should we approach them? The concept of becoming animal offers the beginnings of an answer to this problem by situating Freud's analyses within the broader framework of the history of ideas, in which there are two main ways of approaching, namely through nominal terms, series, and structure. I'm not going to go into all of that now because there is a fully published version that you can check out. So my closing thought for you is really this. Firstly, Haraway's reading of Deleuze and Guattari is clearly misguided and wrong. Secondly, there are real problems in her own work that ought to be examined further. And thirdly, the moratorium on thinking about interpretation in relation to Deleuze and Guattari's work is ultimately very, very self-limiting.